How do you find a group of compatible players? What early conversations can save you problems as the game unfolds? And how do you get your players on board to help build the campaign? That's what this podcast is all about. We'll be sharing new tools for your gaming toolbox and discussing the most important issues a GM faces. My name is Bill.
My name is Colin.
And I'm Megan.
Over the course of this podcast, we're going to give you an overview of the whole process of running a successful game, from putting together a group to wrapping up the last session on a memorable finale. A successful game requires strong foundations. That's why this episode we're talking about getting started.
We'll also be kicking off regular features on what's going down at our own game table, inspiring stuff we've been reading or watching, and a special segment about how to create a stronger connection with your players.
Through their stomachs.
So take a seat at the table,
Grab your dice,
shake, rattle, and roleplay.
Welcome to our segment on inspirations. This is the part of each podcast where we're going to talk about a game, a show, a book, something we've interacted with over the past couple of weeks that has inspired us to think about role-playing or given us a scenario, something that's given us an idea for a setting for a game, given us an idea for a cool way to have characters interact, anything that may have inspired us to bring to the gaming table. So first, this week, we're going to hear from Colin. What's your inspiration?
Well, I mentioned during episode 0 that I was very excited about Thou Art But a Warrior coming out, and it turns out that I actually received my copy today, so that is my pick for this week. Thou Art But a Warrior is a game of tragic stories by Anna Creeder. This is a mod to Ben Lehman's Polaris, a game of tragic storytelling that uses this lyrical way of interacting between the players such that you needn't stop and discuss what is going to happen in the mechanics. The mechanics are built into the dialogue, which is very cool and gives the game this whole sense of lyricalness that feels like sort of a Middle Ages way of talking, and that's sort of the default mode of the game. This is a mod for that, which is about the fall of Muslim Spain during the Crusades, and you play the people who are about to lose.
Cool.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to it for a couple of years since Anna Creeder did an interview on independent insurgency a while back, and I've been excited to get a copy of the game since then, and now there is a print copy with the Polaris rules in it.
What's the one thing that excites you most about this game?
The way that the GM the duties of the game are shared between players is very interesting to me. In this game, there is always an active player, and then I believe it's one of the other players around them is sort of their GM, and then somebody else is the crowd, I believe is the word. At least that is how it works in Polaris, and this is a mod for that. So what is interesting is that everybody at the table is simultaneously a player and a GM and supporting roles, which is, for somebody who's very much into sharing narrative control, that is totally my thing. Anyway, what about you, Bill? What did you bring this week?
I have been reading Ken Height's The Day After Ragnarok. It's a setting that he's been working on for a couple of years. There are editions available for Hero and Savage Worlds, and I understand there's one on the way that is part of the Fate Core Kickstarter, so I'm really looking forward to that. And The Day After Ragnarok is a game that is set in post-World War II in a world where things went kind of differently. The idea being that the Nazi occult experts that we saw chasing the Lost Ark in the Indiana Jones movies summon the Midgard Serpent when they realize that they are losing the war. The Americans manage to destroy the Midgard Serpent before it wreaks too much havoc, but when they drop a nuclear bomb in its skull, its dead body falls across Europe, crushing most of it, and sending a tsunami out across the Atlantic that drowns most of the east coast of North America.
Eep.
Yes, eep indeed. And not only that, but the irradiated giant serpent ichor that falls like nuclear fallout on the world creates freaky snake mutants and monsters everywhere it lands. So it's a pretty entertaining game. It's set in kind of a pulpy 1948 Conan kind of barbarian world. Pretty exciting stuff.
So we got a lot of world destruction in this week's episode, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Not me.
Well, what did you bring this week?
I brought a book that I first read about 6 months ago, and I've been super enthusiastic about since I read it. It's a straight-up novel. It's called Midnight Riot by Ben Aronovich. He's a former Doctor Who writer, kind of way back when. This is the first book in his Peter Grant series, and it's set in London, England. And it's sort of like the Dresden Files if it was set in London, and if all of the magic in the book centered around the geography of London as it is now. So all of the magic is entirely tied into the geography of the city and the way the city works. And the writing is really great. It's really fun. Peter Grant is a wonderful main character, and I can just think of so many things you could do in a game with this kind of urban fantasy, with this particularly English tinge to it. So it's called, again, Midnight Riot by Ben Aronovich. And in the UK, it's known as Rivers of London. So if you see either of those titles, that's the same book.
Okay, so this week we've got 3 things. We've got Thou Art But a Warrior by Anna Creeder.
The Day After Ragnarok by Ken Hite.
And Midnight Riot by Ben Aronovich.
Now we're going to throw into our first discussion topic, finding a group. So now we're going to talk about how to find a new group. You may have moved to a new city recently and want to find new gamers to play with, or perhaps you are looking to push yourself by playing with new people, or perhaps you are simply looking for gamers who are more compatible with yourself. Regardless, we have some ideas about how best to go about doing that in order to find people that are most compatible with your type of play. So we found each other using the internet a couple of years ago.
Yeah, Bill and I moved to London about 5 years ago and didn't really know anybody here. We moved here for me to go to school and got here and had no gaming group anymore.
Weren't sure if we'd ever game again.
I was pretty sure we'd game again, but didn't know with who.
And meanwhile, I was going through much the same thing with some other people. I had in fact found some gamers in London, and those were some pretty bad experiences. Some of them were, at least. I decided to reach out using the Facebook to see if I could find other gamers in the city and maybe help people organize themselves.
And that's where we found you.
Mm-hmm. So I put up notices in local gaming stores about this group I had made online to help people connect to each other and organize each other. And as far as I know, we're the only gamers who ever met as a result of that. Despite that group, I believe, still has like a couple of hundred people in it.
Does it really?
Well, at least 100. Like,
wow.
It's got people in it, or it did at one point. But anyway, I got what I wanted in it. So
you don't care anymore. It's done.
Yes, although I do periodically still get emails of people wondering about wanting to find people for their D&D group.
Mm-hmm. Right. But yeah, and that worked really well. We ended up finding each other. And you were really smart with one of the first things you did, which was, I don't know if you suggested it or we suggested it, first thing you do is go to the pub and have a drink.
Absolutely.
Which is a really good idea before you actually start playing with people, because it gives you a chance to find out if these are people you want to have a beer with, or a beverage of your choice, a coffee if you're a teetotaler. But at any rate, if you don't want to have a beer or a coffee with someone, you probably don't want to play with them either.
Absolutely. I mean, if you don't want to hang out with them, why do you want to game with them?
Exactly.
And it's a good place to meet people in a social situation where there's no pressure. You can ask them questions, learn a little bit more about them before you get into a situation where you're in a game with them and you're finding, oh, maybe this person wasn't the best fit for me.
So what kind of things would you guys look for if you were having a beer with somebody and trying to figure out whether or not you were a compatible player with them?
Well, I think general compatibility as people is the first thing.
No, absolutely. Yeah. But I mean, if we're talking about gaming anecdotes, I assume people don't need advice on whether or not they like people.
Yeah.
So in terms of gaming specific,
I think what you said, gaming anecdotes, listen to the type of stories that people are telling you about the games that they're playing. If you're wanting to do a high-trust, high-drama game like us, and someone is telling you about some hardcore emotional moment that they were able to get to in whatever system,
they might be your kind of scum.
Yeah, exactly. And if all they want to tell you is how tactically they outflanked the orcs, and they don't seem interested in anything about their character, maybe less likely that they want to do our kind of gaming.
Mm-hmm. I think it's important to note that oftentimes, if a person is telling character stories, regardless of the type of game system they're in, it is often a good indicator, because things like D&D are so popular that it is almost inevitably people's introduction to the hobby.
Oh yeah, people are going to have D&D stories. It's how they tell them and what they're pointing out is the important thing for them that might tell you
exactly
if they're compatible.
Exactly so.
That's right. I mean, not every gamer has been lucky enough to sort of be exposed to the kind of games that support the types of play that maybe they're interested in. Colin and I both started out playing D&D. I know Megan started out with Call of Cthulhu.
And shortly thereafter, D&D.
Yeah, I mean, we all have our gamer baggage, right? But that isn't necessarily an indication of where we're going to go.
Absolutely. And, you know, to be frank, I still enjoy that kind of play now and then, but it's not what I'm out for on a week-to-week basis.
Sure.
So one thing we want to say about finding a group is sort of in response to a very influential book, Robin Laws's book.
It's Robin's Laws of Good Game Mastery.
Right, and it's a really excellent book. You should all read it if you haven't. But one of the things it has as a core premise is the idea that you're more or less stuck with the group you have, that they may be the group that you have played with since you were in high school, and that's not going to change. And so as a GM, what you need to do is figure out how to incorporate everybody's different play style, whether they are into character play or tactical play or min-maxing, any of those sorts of things, and you need to please everybody. And that the game you should be running should be one that can please everybody. So while I think he has a lot of really good other advice, we're not entirely sure that that is true anymore for gaming.
Well, I think where we have a bone to pick with him is that we feel like if you have a preference for a particular kind of play, if you seek out like-minded players, you're more likely to be simpatico with them and end up with a final game that is pleasing to everyone involved. If you end up in a situation where you're trying to please everyone, you're in fact likely to end up in a situation where you please no one, because no one's getting enough of what they like out of the game.
Yeah, and you may have a couple of different kinds of players, but you can go in and try to find a group who, again, in our case, is really looking for character-based play, and look for players who want that. There's nothing wrong with trying to amass that group from the beginning.
So essentially, if everybody's after the same type of play, you are much more likely to support each other within that type of play.
Absolutely, and if you're with the group that you've been playing with since high school, that's fine, and you want different kind of play. I mean, if you have time for two groups, maybe see if you can find other people who are more compatible with your style. If you don't, maybe try it for a while anyway, back out of your other group. It's not impossible. But try different ways and try to find people who are going to play the kind of play you want. Because if you have 3 or 4 people who want to do character play at a table, it's really awesome.
There was an instructive anecdote on RPGNet this week where a poster said they were involved in a game where their friends that they gamed with were interested in very lighthearted kind of goofy play. And what they really wanted was to be able to inject some drama into a game. It was a superhero game of some kind, into this game they're playing with their friends. And it struck me as a situation where you have one player that wants to go one way and they're really fighting against the tide of all the rest of the players that are not really interested in that kind of focused, serious play as far as we know. And they may never be okay with that. So in that case, if you're sort of finding yourself unsatisfied with your group, maybe you're in a situation where you have to go outside and seek out like-minded others to maybe try this out. Unless your friends are very open-minded and willing to experiment. And unfortunately, what I have found, and you guys maybe have found the same, is that over the years, people tend to get into a rut with role-playing. They find their favorite game and they stick with that game until, the stars fall.
The campaign that goes on and on and on forever. And it's all, maybe awesome, but there are lots of things out there, and you can probably find compatible people. Or you can certainly go looking for them. There's nothing wrong with saying, look, I want to do drama play. Let's find some people who want to do highly dramatic play.
Or whatever kind of play you're inclined towards. Maybe you've got a group of people that are all interested in serious-minded drama with, heavy character development. And what you really want is tactical play. Good for you. There are people out there. Seek them out. Game better. Yeah. Game with the people that want to do the things you want to do.
Yeah, it doesn't make them not your friends. It doesn't make them not, you're not saying you don't want to hang out with them, but don't necessarily be tied down to the group that you went to high school with.
Absolutely. It doesn't mean you're not friends anymore if you don't game with them every week.
Absolutely.
So in looking for that group, as we said, Colin went to the internet. You said you put up signs at local gaming stores. That's one way to find people, absolutely. Mm-hmm. We also found, and would like to suggest, look for gaming clubs in your area. For instance, we all joined the campus club here in London. And we've actually found a fair number of people we wanted to play with because of that.
Absolutely. I think we've pulled 3-4 people out now by doing that.
I think so.
Yeah.
Just going to mini-cons and playing games and going, oh, that person was fun to play with.
Mm-hmm. So you're lurking at the edge of the herd, preying on the weak, the impressionable that you can separate out.
I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot from nature documentaries.
Well, Bill, you had this happen. You were playing, what was it, a Deadlands game at a con?
Yeah, that's right. An early game that Colin and I played together. We came up to the campus one day and got into it.
At the club, really.
Well, yeah. It was the first we'd heard of it. Mm-hmm. I think it was pretty new at the time.
It was the heat of summer, as I recall.
That's right, that's right. And
Perfect day for Deadlands.
air conditioning was probably at a premium, and we were very pleased to get into a Deadlands game and find a player that we really felt like we connected with, and we wanted to game with her more. So,
and we still do.
We still do. We approached her, and she joined a Firefly game that I ran for a while, and she's still gaming with us years later.
It was really awesome, that game.
And I'm certain we will have. I'm certain we'll probably have that person on the podcast at some point.
I think that's likely.
We'll get Amanda in as a guest star.
Yes.
So I think the other piece of advice we have for those who are trying to put together a group that is going for kind of heavy character play is that don't be too hung up on getting it all perfect the first time.
That's right.
It's very important to know that you will not be in sync with these people right off the bat. You have to feel each other out, get to know each other, how each other play, learn how to support each other.
Yeah.
And learn how to trust each other.
Absolutely.
Yeah, trust and chemistry are something that you build over time, and it's only going to get better if you sort of stick with it and you learn how to play off each other, you learn each other's rhythms, and you experiment with trying different games. You know, you're going to find that right fit, and you're going to build on it.
Yeah, so that first session is not, the bolt from the blue that isn't everything you were always looking for. Like, don't give up. It's something to go from there. I mean, I'm struggling with that. Not struggling. I'm dealing with that right now a little bit with, I've just started running my second game ever, which is set in a sort of steampunk New York, and I've just had the first session. And this is the first time in a long time I've played with mostly new people.
Some of whom are pretty new to role-playing, too.
Yeah, so Colin's in my group. Bill is not. He's running some online games at the same time.
I just whisper in your ear.
Yes, Bill is giving me all sorts of wonderful ideas for what I can do for the players.
Anyway.
Don't listen to that part, Colin. Shh.
Okay. So you're what? Sorry?
What? Nothing.
Okay.
So I'm playing with Colin, who I've played with before, or I'm GMing for Colin. Mm-hmm. But of the other players, two are extremely new to role-playing altogether, and the other one is fairly new to this sort of idea of high-trust, high-drama role-playing, and none of us have ever played together before.
And many of us, don't really know each other.
Yeah, absolutely. Most of them we met through the campus club. Again, that is a really good way to meet people. And we seem to be fairly compatible so far, but we're having to take it slow and figure out how to talk about these things and how to talk about drama and how to set up the situations for each other that allow that to happen. And what I can do as the GM to try to, foster that kind of trust.
And most of your players aren't familiar with the game that you're running either, is that right?
That's right. I mean, I'm running it with PTA, Primetime Adventures, and it's a setting I've created. So the setting, we all created together, so we have all some input into it. But except for Colin, no one has played the system before. And it is a very low crunch system, which is fantastic. It fosters the kind of storytelling I want to do, but it's just going to take time for everyone to become really comfortable with it.
Absolutely. There's a lot of, in that game system too, there's a lot of figuring out boundaries of what is acceptable player behavior.
What do you mean?
In the sense that Primetime Adventures, players have a lot more control over what they are able to do.
Right.
You are, to a certain extent, telling your own story within the context of the game. And players need to figure out how to do that.
Yeah, and what kind of curveballs I may throw at you and how you deal with those curveballs when they come.
Exactly. So all this is part of the process of getting to know each other. And so the point is that, it takes a little bit of time, but once you start going, you can pick up steam and it can get really good.
In our case, I was fairly happy with the first session, but I think it's going to go interesting places from here as we start to learn who each other are and what we want to get out of this game.
Absolutely.
At least I'm hoping so.
All right, let's move on to our next segment. We're going to talk about something that's happened at our table recently and how it might help you at yours.
Lock your keys in the house next door and attach your favorite things to the bathroom floor. And as you're waiting...
This is going to be a regular segment on our show where we talk about things that are happening at our table. And maybe what happens for us will be inspirational or something you'd be interested in too. In this case, we're going to be talking about a game that I'm running right now called Sherwood, which is kind of my take on the old Rocket Robin Hood cartoon, but I'm sort of playing it more seriously. What we wanted to talk about was something that happened at the beginning of the first episode of the game, where the player characters in that game return from a mission to discover discover that the leader of their outlaw band had been killed while they were off-world, leaving them in an uncertain situation as to how they're going to proceed. I was a little surprised to learn over dinner that you guys had concerns about this. Why don't you talk about that?
For me personally, it wasn't concerned so much as that it was a little bit surprising. It was a character we'd never met, and it wasn't that I minded one way or another, but it was kind of odd to jump right to that part of the game where the leader's been killed, but I don't know who he is. I found that interesting that you jumped that far ahead, because I know you are a big proponent of starting in the middle and getting to the good stuff as soon as possible, but that just seemed like a really abrupt jump. What about you, Colin?
Well, I think that in many ways that worked. It certainly put you on the path to towards your character issue of like the loneliness of being a leader very, very quickly.
My character is essentially the Robin Hood analog. So essentially the old Robin Hood, the old leader of the outlaws just died, and I am slowly assuming that mantle.
If there was a problem with it, it was a fairly minor one in that it only went on for about 5-10 minutes. In that when we returned, I was not sure how to react to the news because I did not know how my character felt about this person. Whether he was a good leader, whether he was a bad leader, whether I liked him or not. And so until we sort of took the temperature of how everybody else was reacting, I didn't feel like it was possible for me to react to the news.
So what I'm sort of interested in is asking you, Bill, I mean, how do you decide where to start? Like I said, I know you're a real proponent of getting to the good stuff right away, and how do you tread that line between getting right to the good stuff and giving us enough background to have it have meaning?
Well, I think for me, like you said, part of it is a matter of starting the story as late as possible. That's kind of a general piece of wisdom that's passed along in the story writing world as a good way to proceed with the story because you have as little extraneous material as possible. For this game, I realized when I was preparing for the first episode that although I had planned sort of a longer arc game, what I really felt like doing was sort of tightening it up, making it maybe 6 episodes instead of 10 or 12. And although I had initially planned that the leader of the band was going to be around to sort of teach you the ropes of what being a space outlaw was all about, you know, send you on a couple of missions where you would sort of get familiarity with what the rules of the game were, I decided that since what this game was really going to be about was about Megan's characters taking on the mantle of leader, that was the important thing, that it was really important that we get to that right away. And I decided it really wasn't important to have those 3 episodes where the bandit leader was there to kind of teach you the exposition bits.
And where that really worked for me, although I didn't have any particular attachment to the outlaw leader, is I really got thrown into the position of having to take on that mantle way sooner than I thought. So kind of what you did to me as a player, because I was unprepared for it, really helped inform how my character was utterly unprepared for suddenly becoming the leader of an outlaw band.
So the confusion of what was happening actually served to simulate how your character would be feeling in that moment.
Yeah, it really fueled kind of how I played it, going, okay, I have to do what?
Right.
I think the other part of that decision for me was a sort of general piece of kind of GM wisdom that in any game, the player characters have to be the most important part of the story. And if you've got someone else who's around who is like a mentor or someone that is someone for them to look up to in some way, then they feel kind of like a second fiddle or like they're chafing against that. So I wanted to get rid of him as quickly as possible, just as on that general principle, to kind of get them making the important decisions themselves and get everything moving forward.
So I think we were largely positive on the move as far as its effects on the game.
Right. If I had kind of thought about this a little more ahead of time, what I probably would have done when we came to sit down and plan out what the game was going to be was I would have said, I'm thinking that the leader is going to have just died as we pick up the story, so this will be an issue in the game for you guys to deal with. But like I say, that was a decision I made very late in the game, so...
And as it's turned out, our deceased leader has actually stuck around in that, I don't know if you guys have interacted with him, but I know I've talked with his ghost twice.
Well, yes, that's true.
Yeah, for a guy who's dead, he's sort of been a presence in the game, so...
Certainly for me.
I've been way too busy having no arms to notice him.
That does kind of take up a lot of your attention.
Yes.
Also sleeping with starship captains.
That too. So, I think you're right that just sort of having that moment there where we say our relationship to this person would absolutely solve any kind of problem there, and then at that point you'd just be golden.
For sure.
And it's been really fun. Like, we're really enjoying the game. But I just want to talk about, how you pick that moment, how you come to that point.
Yeah, I mean, the thing here is not that this was a problem. The thing here is that this was an interesting move to make, and its effects have been interesting. And then how can we improve that for next time?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right. So now we're going to go on to a segment where we talk about social contract. It's a big issue in all the gaming world these days, and we're going to talk about how to have that conversation.
There's a fire that's fueling in the workplace as it describes an old friend's fall from grace. You can't just go, get up and leave. My hands remain ingrained in your history.
Social contract is really important, and it's a discussion most people don't have when they sit down to game. At its very basic level, it is the nuts and bolts of how people are expected to act when they're supposed to show up, all of that sort of thing. And at a larger level, it should encompass what players are comfortable with and what people are expecting to come to the table, and specifically things that they never want to see at the table. It's a discussion that people often skip. They figure they'll just figure it out during play. We would strongly, strongly suggest that you have these social contract discussions from the beginning, and then, again, as much as necessary.
I think the other assumption that people regularly have, oftentimes they'll be gaming with the same group for a long period of time, and they will assume that they know all their friends' sort of preferences and foibles and maybe the things that turn them off. And that may or may not be true. And the only way that you know for sure is when you suddenly have an awkward moment, when something comes up that is not comfortable for someone at your table, and you realize that they have had a bad time during that session because you didn't talk about something.
Yeah, and you want to avoid that at all costs. We're doing this because it's fun.
And this really becomes even more important when you're dealing with people who are strangers.
Yes, absolutely. If you're gaming with a new group, you need to sit down and do this. So first we're going to discuss the nitty-gritty issues, and then we're going to kind of take it out larger to some of the more larger theoretical things that you might want to discuss to give you some sort of framework for having this sort of discussion with your fellow players or your players if you're the GM.
Right. The entry-level stuff with social contract is just what kind of behavior is acceptable around your table. If you are going to have, let's say, electronic devices around your table, are cell phones on or off? Are people allowed to have laptops? That kind of thing. Are they allowed to be on the internet while you're playing?
Drinks.
Absolutely. Can you drink alcoholic beverages or...
Is it going to be eating at the table? Are you just focused on what you're doing? And if you're eating, who's bringing the food? Are people sharing? Are you making food collectively?
At what time are you late?
Yeah, absolutely. If you have an absence, is the game going to go on without you? Or is it the case where you need everybody present to play? And so you need to let people know as far in advance as possible if you are going to be absent.
Certainly in a character-focused game, it is very difficult to proceed without everybody around the table. I think we've certainly learned that.
Yeah, and life is going to happen. People are going to be absent, but just, what are your expectations for when people are going to show and not? What happens when they're not there? What's a reasonable hour to show up by?
Mm-hmm. I think we'll probably get, towards the end of the segment, we'll probably get into some of our own recommendations for what works for us. But yeah, the important thing to take from this is that there's a lot about player behavior, the way the players interact with each other at the table that is important, and you should discuss. Do not skip this.
Yes, absolutely. Well, let's do our suggestions now since we're talking about it.
Certainly.
We certainly find for our type of play, devices are a real distraction because a lot of our games focus on the people who are not actually in the scene being the audience and really being there and being present to appreciate what their fellow players are bringing to the table.
Well, in addition to that, there may be plot threads that can be picked up by that player, even though they were not in the scene. Something that may be relevant to them is mentioned, or some way that they can later barb that player because they know what is going on.
Yeah, and you may have to be flexible, but for us, the fewer devices, the better, I would say.
However, of course, if there's somebody's phone rings, it usually means that there's something important happening, and of course, that person is okay to answer the phone.
Right.
Just bears mentioning.
Around our table, our gaming group is made up of adult gamers, and we have learned that certainly scheduling is sometimes a problem because people have obligations that maybe take them out of the city or even out of the country or what have you. There's a million little things that keep them from the table. And what keeps our group functional sometimes is the fact that we keep up the line of communications. And if someone can't make it, they try and let everyone know as far ahead of time as possible so we're not all sitting on our hands with nothing to do on Saturday night.
Yeah, and in our group we've actually had to do, so we kind of have 2 games running at a time.
At least.
At least. So if there's a player who can only be there about half the time, when he's there we play the game with him, and when he's not, we play another game, so that we keep up the gaming every week, but it varies widely which game we're playing.
Absolutely. So yeah, I think we, at times we've had a rotation of 3 different games going, depending on who is present at the table.
Yeah, and recently we've always had the backup of, if somebody can't show up the last minute, we play Fiasco. That's a great fill-in game if you ever need one.
Absolutely. And you can throw it together in 2 minutes' notice.
There you go. As far as things like drinking go, at our table, we certainly find that having a glass of wine while we're gaming is not a problem, but we don't have anybody who has a problem with alcohol at our table, so...
Sometimes it's even beneficial, I find, to make yourself sort of slide into character a little bit more easily. Forget yourself a little bit and get past those fuck it moments just a little bit more easily. But yes, none of us ever consume enough that we get silly, at least not deliberately.
No.
You have those evenings where you have a single glass of wine and that seems to be all you need.
You are unexpectedly wingy.
Yes, but, you take those moments as they come.
Yeah. But it may be different for your group if you have someone who has a problem with alcohol, or if everyone habitually drinks way too much. Maybe you need to take that off the table. That's entirely group specific.
And maybe that's just what your group is like, but I find, at least we find that tends to be difficult to do deep character play.
We also find, and I think this is a good general rule of role-playing, that for our table, it's advantageous to have a break between 9 and 9:30 where we will often have tea, maybe dessert, and we just all take a breather for a few minutes and collect ourselves, and it gives us the extra stamina we need to get into the second half of the evening. It's just generally a good thing to have that break built in to a session, I find, because for the GM and for the players, it's a good time to collect themselves and reset. And, maybe if there's something coming up that needs discussion, you've got that moment built right in.
Mm-hmm. Or if we completely screw up your plans, you can go cry in the bathroom.
But Megan, you and I often will have moments where we will like something that happened in the first act, and we will decide deliberately to pick it up in the second act and run a little scene about it.
Yeah.
And that is a great time to do that without distracting any of the other players.
Yeah, absolutely.
Something else that will probably lead into our next topic a bit later, but bears mentioning here, is that we always eat together, or at least we try to always eat together as much as possible.
Yeah, and we'll talk in a minute about why that's a particularly good idea. I think if you can, again, it's not going to work for everybody, but when you can eat together, it fills a couple of important functions, and that will actually be a regular segment.
Yes, and this is absolutely a social contract issue, but it is very important, and we will go on more about that in the next segment, I suspect.
Well, these sorts of details are a really good way to kind of get into your social contract discussion, to introduce it to your players, and just kind of get these nitty-gritty things hammered out. But that is not all of the social contract discussion, and it's probably not the most important part.
Right, so you have this whole section we've discussed so far is all the stuff that is about how the players interact with the other players and having rules for that.
The out-of-game stuff.
Right, and so we have there's this whole second layer of what about in the game?
Right.
What are we comfortable with? What do we not want?
Yeah, and it's a good way to say to people, what do you never want to see in a game? And there's some really good reasons to ask that question and to encourage people to be as frank as possible. You have a really good example that involves me from playing Penny for My Thoughts.
Yeah, I ran, for anybody who's not familiar with it, Penny for My Thoughts is a GM-less game where you play amnesiacs who are recovering their memories. And there are memory triggers in the middle of the table, which are just concepts that are written on pieces of paper. Sometimes they're sensory information.
Yeah, smells or sights or, words.
Yeah, exactly so. And we had been playing together a couple of years by that point, but we skipped this discussion. It had never come up. And we ran smack into Problem for You. We got to the final phase of the game. Megan drew a memory trigger and got...
the smell of burning hair.
And Megan has a problem with fire.
Yes, I was in a fire when I was little, and it's, in general, the concept doesn't bother me anymore, but when I was playing a game that required me to kind of really connect with the sensory input, and it was something that I know really well, I know what burned hair smells like, I hate what burned hair smells like, and when I got that as a memory trigger, it just made me shut down.
Right.
I just can't cope with it. And I didn't tell anyone. This is the problem. I really should have, but I just kind of went internal and tried to back away from it as much as possible, and because my fellow players didn't know that, they kept pushing me towards the fire.
Yes, because that, as our role as the other players, is sort of our job to help you push that along. To everybody else that read that, I don't know what to do with this.
Yeah, and you're trying to push me towards the more emotional stuff, whereas in my head I'm going, get away from this, get away from the fire, now.
Yes. Now, Penny for My Thoughts is a pretty serious game. It can be pretty grim, everything's kind of dire in it. So it's possible that it triggered you more than it might otherwise.
Absolutely.
However, the principle here is that if you're going to be doing character stuff, you want to have this stuff on the table.
Now, Colin, I know that you have run the game a couple of times since then. How have you dealt with that problem since that problem came up?
Well, I most often run it at cons, and what I have found the best way to deal with it is by opening a discussion with the players during the initial phase of the game and saying asking people what they don't want to have discussed at the table.
And you put something on the table first, is
Yes,
that right?
exactly.
You lead the discussion?
Exactly. So my worry is that when I initially came up with this idea, I was pretty sure that unless something was already on the table, nobody would want to be the uncool guy who isn't cool with something. So I always put on the table sexual violence, because in a con game crowd, it's probably not something anybody's going to be really comfortable dealing with anyway, but it breaks the ice. So there's nothing lost there.
You just say, I don't ever want to see sexual violence in this game. I
we
just
are-
can't deal with it.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then, what do you guys not want to see? What would be a problem for you? And by opening that discussion, it gets them talking. I'm already the uncool guy, but I'm not that uncool because I'm really that cool. So, but all future games of that have run really well, and I've managed to avoid, as far as I know, upsetting anybody. And I, in fact, ran a game just a couple months ago at our big con here locally, and it went well.
This might be a useful time to talk about the idea of lines and veils, which is something else that's had a lot of currency in the RPG world recently. Bill, do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
I think it was Ron Edwards that came up with this idea in his game Sorcerer. Now, the idea is that lines are something that all the players agree they never want to see in a game. Stuff that is completely off limits. A veil is something that, maybe is a little iffy, but people are okay with it in a game. But what they would prefer is that it is not on screen. When we have something that people are maybe not completely comfortable with, the camera pans away or we fade to black. And something that often fits the description of a veil in our games would probably be sex.
Mm-hmm. Our characters will often have sexy times with somebody, and we always people exchange some good one-lines, and then we fade to black.
Yeah, we flirt a little bit, you get the chemistry up, and then we know what happens from there.
Yeah.
And actually, fire has become not a line, but a veil for me, because recently in a game you ran, Colin, because you know that's an issue for me, you said, I'm going to have this house fire, I think, in the next episode. This NPC I have you play is in it. Is that okay? I don't plan on going into great detail, and that's pretty much...
And how can we deal with that in a way that you would be comfortable with? I'm thinking like this.
Yeah. And I said, yes, I think I'm okay with her being the house fire, just please do not describe in great detail what the house fire is like.
Right.
And that worked fine.
So in the way we dealt with it at the time was that rather than, this was Bill's character going into the house, rather than following Bill's character into the house and through the house, we stopped at the front door and sort of described the outside of the building, and I tried to describe it in such a way that it seemed like tension was increasing as the house was losing structural integrity, and then he emerged back out. But point was that we didn't go in.
Yeah, and we weren't discussing it in great detail, and I was fine with that.
Right. And so that worked for you, and
Yeah, absolutely. And other things people may want to see, as you said, sexual violence is something I don't really want to ever see rape at the table.
I'm not really comfortable with.
No.
Yeah.
Isms are often a big one, and talk to people. Maybe people want them, or maybe they only want them in certain circumstances. Racism, sexism, anything like that. Just be aware of where people stand on it.
Yeah, I mean, the way we usually deal with it at our table is we acknowledge that it exists, but we try not to allow it to limit anything, and we try not to allow it to become casual.
Yes, that's my big thing, is I always say I don't really want to deal with casual sexism at the table, but with the GM I trust, I'm perfectly fine with having sexism be one of my character issues. For instance, in Bill's Victorian Buffy game we're playing right now, I'm a 16-year-old Slayer, and she is limited by the fact that she is a 16-year-old female in Victorian England who knows how to do nothing but fight. And so my main issue is the sexism of the society, and that's very interesting for me. But on the other hand, if I'm just playing a pickup game, I don't really want to be in a situation where the other players think it's cool to slap me on the ass and call me honey. Even just metaphorically in the game, I'll probably want to shoot them.
Right. The distinction there is that we are trying to make the topic important in the game, and we're approaching it sensitively and in a way that it doesn't make the game not fun for you.
Yeah, Absolutely. And I've had a lot of fun with that so far.
You've dealt with the issue of sexism yourself as a GM, Megan, in your Around Midnight game that you ran this past summer. I was playing a flapper in this game, and we had moments where people observed that it was basically unusual for me to be behaving in certain ways. I was going into an asylum, and I was told by a guard that, man, maybe you don't want to go in there, it's pretty gruesome in there, and I pushed my way past him because I'm a poet and I know what I'm doing.
That may be debatable, but yeah, I didn't try to limit who you were or what you could do. Because that similarly in the same game, Bill was playing a black character, and he said, I don't want racism to be my character's main issue. I don't want this to be the big thing I run up against every time. That was fine.
So what we found was ways of acknowledging that it existed without allowing it to ever be a limit on who we are or what we do.
Yeah, so I didn't deprotagonize you guys by going, look, you are this thing. Now you cannot do these things. And that might have been accurate in history, that you would have encountered much more virulent sexism or racism, but just because it would have happened in history doesn't mean it's fun at the table.
That's right, and it's all about what's fun. And not only that, acknowledging that you're interested in putting an issue on the table and sort of, grappling with it also doesn't mean that it's the only thing in the world that we ever acknowledge with you.
Right.
With your Vampire Slayer character, we touch on sexism once in a while, but it's not a drumbeat that happens every time you're on screen.
Yeah.
It's something that we touch on, and it's important, but it is just part of a big tapestry.
Right. It's not the only thing about my character.
Yeah. So I think the place we have found in general with the isms is that we will acknowledge that they exist, but try not to allow them to be limiting, unless the player has specifically said, this is a thing I'm interested in exploring.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing to say about social contracts is they should be open for negotiation. People may not remember something in the moment of having that social contract discussion. They may forget that they really don't want to see something. And there should be something that's an open document that later on you can go, yeah, I really should have mentioned the fact that, for instance, I don't like to hear about fire. Like, this needs to be something that is going to change over time.
Mm-hmm. Right. It's an ongoing discussion, and one that you should continue to have as you play, as your games continue, and as you play different games.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, it sounds like it's an unfun discussion. It sounds like it's going to be a downer. But the fact is, it makes games way more fun, because you don't have to worry that you've just made life miserable for one of your players because you didn't even realize something was a hot button issue for them.
Yeah, it's freeing.
Yes.
You don't want to do it by accident, is the thing.
Exactly so. Okay, so that's pretty much our discussion on the issue of social contract at the table. I hope some of that was useful to you. Next, we're going to talk about food at the table, which, as I mentioned, is part of the social contract, but there's so much more to say.
When you're on a mountain with faces in the sea, they're on to something, wallowing beneath.
So now we're going to be introing a segment that we're going to be doing on hopefully all of our shows going forward called Breaking Bread. In this segment, we're going to talk about food.
Delicious food.
Mm-hmm. So the reason food is so important at the game table is that food, in so many ways, in this culture, unites us. It's part of every event. Go out on a date, you always have dinner or lunch or something. When people have baby showers, there's food. When people have funerals, there's always food at the reception. When you are happy, you probably celebrate by eating. When you are sad, you probably mourn by eating.
It's very much a community thing, right?
Absolutely.
It's when people come together and get to know each other better.
Absolutely, and people chat over food. They get to know each other over food. In the context of the game, it's really important that we, one, sort of feel like a group, that we're not just a group of people who get together and all we do is game. These are your friends, right? You got to get together and actually talk with them. And part of that is getting the chat out before you actually start playing. If you don't get a chance to talk to your friends, then you're going to end up in the middle of the game. You might be in the middle of a really good scene and you realize, oh my god, I bought a house and I forgot to tell my friends. And you might stop everything that you're doing and go oh my god, guys, I forgot to tell you this important thing. So it's really important to get together ahead of time and get that chat out, get all that small talk out. Doesn't mean it's going to prevent every instance of that, but it's important. And again, these are your friends.
Well, it also creates sort of difficulties. I don't know about you guys, but in our case, feeding, say, 5 hungry gamers, that's not a small task. So part of what we're going to do, as well as talking about the pleasures of food, is give you some ideas for what will feed a large group of hungry people.
Right. This is something that Megan and I especially seem to be the ones that take the bull by the horns on this. This is Bill most often often as running a game, and then Megan and I often, this is what we do for the table. Most often, not always. But so how do we feed a bunch of hungry gamers? You have to deal with allergies. You have to deal with tastes. You have to deal with, if this is after work, you have to deal with getting something on the table relatively quickly. How do you distribute the costs of doing this equally?
How do you have enough food?
How do you have enough food? That is an eternal question. So what we're going to do is, in segments going forward, we're going to give recipe suggestions, ideas for cooking. Hopefully some of you guys will have some good ideas too, and maybe you'll share them. None of this is to say that there's anything wrong with ordering a pizza, and certainly we do that, with some frequency. It depends on the week, and if everybody's having a shitty week and nobody feels like cooking, we definitely order a pizza. But there's better stuff out there.
Better than pizza?
Absolutely.
Your argument is invalid.
Or you could make your own pizza and it could be even better.
Tell me more of this homemade pizza.
Well, you're going to have to wait for a later episode to get that, Bill. However, what I am going to say for this week is that on the topic of pizza, as you say, pizza is awesome. However, you know what's also awesome? Not falling asleep when you're playing.
What?
So,
Sorry,
we nodded off
sleep,
there.
yeah.
What?
Something that we often do as gamers is we tend to pick starch-heavy meals for our gaming groups. Stuff like pasta, stuff like pizza, stuff like
awesome.
Yeah, stuff like awesome. And you should eat awesome stuff.
Delicious starch.
Right. Fresh bread. Like, there's really very little in the world that is better than fresh bread. But
You sound like you're really sandbagging your own argument here, dude.
But that shouldn't be all you eat. If it is all you eat, what you're going to find is that your blood sugar level is going to rush up, and then you're going to crash, and you're going to have one of those evenings where everybody finishes their meal, and you all retire to the couch just to, sit for a couple of minutes and gather yourself for the game, and then you're not going to end up playing. Everybody's going to be sitting on the couch pretending to watch TV and sort of actually dozing, falling asleep on the couch.
That never happened to our group.
Right.
I'm pretty sure of that.
Sometimes that happens specifically when you feed me coffee.
Yeah, you're weird.
Yeah.
I don't understand your biochemistry.
Sometimes there is coffee, and then sometimes there is a sleep Megan.
Right, but because we're not all Megan, so it's worth discussing, well, how do we avoid this? The easy way to do it is just eat some vegetables.
Vegetables?
Vegetables. Easiest way you could possibly do this is just buy one of those prepackaged, dippable vegetable things at your grocery store, at your market, whatever. Get some nice dip, put it on the table.
Crudités, if you will.
Or, as in our high-class way we refer to them, credites.
Right. So have some delicious credites with some nice dip. I'm not saying that has to be all you eat. You should definitely have the bread or the pasta or whatever. But if you also have some vegetables in you, it'll just slow everything down a little bit. Make sure that you don't crash. Or if you do crash, you don't crash quite so hard. And then you will still have energy for the game, and you won't be falling asleep during your important character scene that you've been waiting for 3 weeks.
So in essence, your advice is that of mothers everywhere, eat your veggies.
Eat some fucking vegetables, seriously.
Okay, well then, maybe next time we'll talk about how to make homemade pizza. Will that satisfy you, Bill?
No, that doesn't help me tonight.
Too bad.
Well, maybe we can get you something when we're done here, but how about we can definitely plan to talk about homemade pizza next time. We have a lot of thoughts on this. In fact, we will probably, over the course of this show, put out a number of pizza-based suggestions, but we'll start with one.
So that about wraps up what we have to say on those very first things of finding a group and creating a social contract. Next, we're going to move on to, say you're a GM, you got a great game you want to run, and you got to get your players amped about it. So we're going to talk about the pitch, how to find that game you want to run, and how to sell people on it. So until next time, I'm Megan.
I'm Bill.
And I'm Colin.
And this is Shake, Rattle, and Roleplay.
If we mean love, then I'll hold you.
Thanks for listening. For more Shake, Rattle, and Roleplay, drop by our Facebook page.
Softest pitch to the hardest break of dawn.
We'd love to hear from you if you have any questions, comments, or ideas for stuff you'd like to hear on the show. Email us at shakerpg@gmail.com or follow us on Twitter at shakerpg.
With both my arms. If we mean love.
Music on our show was kindly provided by Little City, a great Canadian band you guys should totally check out. You can buy their album on iTunes or visit them online at littlecityband.com.
Mine. And practice calm and cool through troubled times. If I mean love, then I'll hold you up to the sky.
So next time, we're going to be talking about the
Pitch.
right,
The bitch?
the pitch.
The pitch.
Oh!
The pitch. That's right, folks. Next time, the bitch.
You're a bad guy, man.
That's true.
I smell a second credit cookie.